Melanie always appeared flawless, but the changes became obvious. Late returns, strange calls, and her desire for more freedom. Edgar initially doubted, but the trace she couldn't hide revealed the truth. On her phone, he found messages from another man, words that could no longer be explained as mere flirta. When he confronted her with the facts, Melanie tried to justify herself, but her trembling voice and downcast gaze spoke louder than words. For Edgar, this wasn't Jay. He decided to act. Forgiveness? Too simple. He began planning a cold, calculated revenge that would make Melanie feel the true cost of betrayal, a pain that would stay with her forever. Cheating wife was shocked by my wealth. She asked for money, but what I did left her speechless. Have you ever felt like your life suddenly changes, and you can't even explain why? I didn't know how she found out. I didn't know why it happened. And when I looked into her eyes, I realized, everything will be different now. This is how it all started. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at my reflection. Only now did I begin to realize how much had changed. My appearance, my style, my state of mind. I had become a different person, and it wasn't because of external changes, but because money had come into my life. A lot of money. I never planned for this. It all started when I decided to invest in a risky project. And now, when I look at myself, I can't tell whether I'm happy about it or scared. Melanie, my wife, was stunned by my success, but she wasn't ready for what I was about to tell her. And now, standing in front of the mirror, I was contemplating how it would all turn out. How would she react? That night, when I came home late, Melanie was already waiting for me on the couch. She was looking at her phone, but when I entered, her eyes met mine, and I immediately felt something was wrong. "Are you late again?" she asked, trying to stay calm. I knew this wasn't just a question. It was a test. "Yes, the meeting ran late," I replied, even though I knew that wasn't exactly true. In reality, I was just wondering how to tell her about my new earnings and wasn't sure if I should tell her at all. Melanie was sitting on the couch, her gaze covered with a certain coldness, but I noticed how her hand lingered on my shoulder when I sat next to her. "Something has changed in you, Edgar," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off her phone. "I see how you're changing. You've become different, and I don't know if that's good or bad." I didn't know how to respond. How do you explain to her that everything is changing so fast that I can barely catch up with it all? "Melanie, it's just part of the job. I'm always working," I tried to deny again. But she had no intention of stopping. "You've shut yourself off. You don't tell me what's happening in your life anymore. I see how you go to meetings that never happened before, how you get calls at night. You don't want me to know the truth, do you?" Her words struck a chord in my heart again. I realized she had started to suspect, but didn't fully understand what was going on. So, I decided to confess. "Melanie, I made money. A lot of money," I said, trying not to sound too smug. I knew her reaction would be important, but I couldn't predict what would happen next. She went silent. There was something in her eyes that I couldn't decipher. It was a mixture of surprise and something else. She set her phone aside and turned to face me. "Are you kidding me? How much?" Her voice became sharp. "Enough that you don't have to worry about money anymore," I replied, trying not to show how nervous I was about her reaction. She looked at me like she had just seen me in a new light. I noticed how her eyes glistened, and my heart tightened. "And now you want me to believe you," she said, raising an eyebrow. "You've changed, Edgar. Now you're the one I always wanted." And in her words, I realized everything that had been happening lately wasn't a coincidence. She had seen how my life had changed, and maybe she liked it more than I thought. But, in truth, it hadn't started with the money. It started with how I had changed, how I stopped sharing my thoughts and plans with her, how she started asking questions that I didn't have answers to. Melanie raised her hand, as if she wanted to touch me, but then stopped, hesitating. "And now? Am I supposed to be grateful?" she asked, smirking. "Money can't buy everything, Edgar. But it can change our lives," I answered, looking her in the eye. Melanie fell silent, and once again, there was a pause. I realized that something was off this time. My wife wasn't the same as before. She was scheming. But what? I started to notice that Melanie had become different. At first, it was small things. She stayed later at work in the evenings, and in the mornings, she was often late. Then she started showing less interest in me, in what was going on in my life. Although I didn't show much concern, there was something in her behavior that set me on edge. It seemed like she had stopped being the same open eyes that used to look at me with a smile when we first met. One evening, after several long days when we hardly spoke, I decided to talk to her. "Melanie, what's going on with you?" I asked, sitting in our living room. She walked over to the window, gazing at the cityscape. There was a sense of detachment in her posture, as if she were physically here but her mind was somewhere else. Her silence only heightened my feeling that something wasn't right. She turned to me, letting out a small sigh. "You don't even notice how much you've changed, Edgar. I don't know what's happening with you. You've become a completely different person, and I don't know if I like it." "I'm just working," I replied, trying to avoid a deeper conversation. I honestly didn't understand why she was reacting this way. Maybe the money had changed me more than I wanted to admit. She looked at me with that same cold smile. "No, it's not just work. You no longer discuss anything important with me. You don't share your plans. All I hear is I'm making money. But what are you going to do with that money, Edgar? You're not just accumulating it, right?" I didn't answer. I could feel myself starting to lose control of the situation. All I had wanted was to secure our future, and now I was in a situation where I couldn't even explain my motives. But Melanie had changed. She was no longer the wife I had planned my whole life with. She started spending more time outside the home, meeting with friends more often, and her looks had changed, as if she didn't quite see me anymore. A few days later, I started noticing new details. She was becoming more and more distant. Sometimes, I would find her phone left on the table, and I couldn't help but notice how her messages were becoming more mysterious. She often smiled while reading them, but never showed who was sending them. That evening, like always, Melanie was busy with her own things. I couldn't stay in the shadows any longer, so I decided to take a risk. I knew it might be a bad idea, but my patience was running thin. "Melanie, who is this?" I pointed at her phone, which was lying on the table as usual. She didn't seem to expect the question, and her face immediately darkened. "It's nothing important," she replied, not lifting her gaze. It was the usual explanation, but I already felt that she was hiding something. "I want to know who it is," I said, my words no longer calm. She raised her gaze, and my voice softened, but I could feel that everything was starting to change. "It's my colleague," she answered again, but her eyes were no longer convincing. "We're just working on a project. You don't need to worry." But I didn't believe her. It was too simple. I knew something had changed between us, and I could no longer stay indifferent. Melanie started coming home later and later in the evenings. At first, I just thought her work was picking up again. The blog, her job, meetings with partners. However, the more time passed, the more I noticed her gaze becoming colder, and her reactions less emotional. It seemed like she was returning from those meetings as a different person. One evening, when she came home after yet another meeting with her friends, I noticed how her posture had changed. She stood in front of the mirror, not looking at me, adjusting her appearance, checking every detail in the reflection. "You look great," I said, trying to maintain some connection. Melanie just nodded, continuing to gaze at herself in the mirror. "Is that a new dress?" I asked, trying to steer the conversation onto a familiar topic, but Melanie didn't respond right away. It was as if she didn't hear me. "Yeah, it's from the new collection," she finally said, glancing at me briefly. Her voice was neutral, as if nothing had changed. I decided not to push with more questions, but it still began to worry me. Melanie had always been passionate about fashion, but now something felt different. I started paying attention to her behavior. She became less emotional, talked more about money and status. She wasn't the one who used to happily spend time at home anymore. We barely spoke, and in the evenings, she often came home late from work or meetings with friends. The next day, when I got home earlier from work, I found her sitting on the couch with her phone in hand. It wasn't unusual. We often sat next to each other, checking social media or just reading the news. But this time, her attention was entirely focused on the screen, and she didn't even notice me. I quietly approached her, but she immediately looked up. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She nodded, but her gaze seemed distant. "Melanie, Is it that same man again? I asked, pointing to the phone. She paused for a moment, staring at the screen, then quickly turned away, as if nothing had happened. You're overreacting, Edgar. Her voice was cold. He's just a work partner. Nothing more. I wasn't convinced. There was something in her behavior that kept raising alarms. She started talking more often about the project with this man, his help in developing her blog. I had no doubt this was part of her life, but I felt like it was more than just work now. All these hints, all the references to joint work and partnership, it looked like a cover-up. A few days later, I was home alone again, and Melanie went off to another meeting. I didn't call her, even though various thoughts were running through my head. I decided to check for myself. This time, I didn't want to wait. Melanie had left her laptop in the kitchen, and I could smell her scent on the keyboard. My fingers trembled at first, but I gathered myself. I opened the laptop and without hesitation went into her email. The first thing I saw was a message from her colleague, this mysterious man. How are you? I miss you. My heart grew heavy as I read it. Melanie had always been so careful about not leaving such traces, but this time, it seemed like she was a bit careless. However, I tried not to jump to conclusions. I opened a few more emails and saw their conversations about work, projects, and the future. But one message from him particularly caught my attention. What do you want me to do for you, Melanie? These words had nothing to do with work. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything. I just closed the laptop and placed it back where it was. A few hours later, when she came home, I heard her footsteps from the hallway. Melanie entered the room and walked up to me. In her eyes, I saw an inexplicable calmness, but there was something in her gaze that I couldn't understand. She looked a little distracted, as usual, but it didn't make me feel any better. What did you do today? She asked, trying to sound casual. I just worked from home, checked some documents, I replied, trying to hide the fact that I knew more than I wanted to. Melanie smiled, but her smile seemed forced. She sat down beside me and started talking about her day, but I couldn't focus on her words. My heart was racing as I thought about everything I had discovered. From the next day, things got even more difficult. Melanie became more distant. She spent more time out of the house. She often talked about meetings with friends, but I noticed how her gaze became less engaged when she was home. One day, when she came back after another night out, I noticed a small red mark on her neck, something I couldn't ignore. I felt it was too obvious, and that she was trying to hide it. What's that? I asked, pointing to her neck. Melanie immediately tilted her head to cover the mark, but I still saw it. Did you notice something? She asked, her voice so calm that it surprised me even more. I could feel my suspicion growing, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Later that evening, when she went to the bathroom, I decided to check her messengers again. This time, I found even more messages from that same man. There were a few more business emails from him, but then, the same thing again. I desire you, Melanie. When will we meet? Reading this became unbearably painful. I realized that I could no longer wait. So, I decided to take action. A few days later, I decided to take a leave of absence and not tell Melanie about my plans. I sent her a message, I'm going on a business trip, I'll be back in a few days. It was just an excuse to leave her without attention. At that time, I made a couple of calls and asked my friends to check on her. I was fully determined to find out the truth. When I returned home after 3 days, I was calm. It seemed like I had gotten what I wanted, but she didn't change her behavior. She was calm and even more attentive to me. She didn't ask why I came back so early, but her gaze remained cold. But when I approached the closet and saw her makeup bag, I noticed something else, a small gym membership that she had started using. This was another signal for me. She hadn't realized that she had left it there. I could no longer hold back my desire to know more. The next day, I took the final step. The moment Melanie left for her next meeting, I grabbed her laptop and checked it again. And there he was, the same man she had been texting with repeatedly. But this time, I found something very important. Her response was very strange. She wrote, I'll do it when you come back to town. You can't imagine how badly I want you right now. Edgar decided that he would no longer chase answers and chose to shift his focus. He no longer wanted to waste his energy constantly checking messages and tracking her every move. Now, he had money, which came from a successful business deal, and he decided it was time to relax. After all, if Melanie was acting so strangely, he deserved a break. On Friday evening, after Melanie went to her usual meeting with friends, Edgar decided to invite his friends to a bar. He hadn't had a good time in a while, and now he had the chance to unwind. Without thinking long, he called his old friends, John, Mark, and Lewis. They hadn't seen each other in a while, so Edgar had no doubt that the evening would be fun. The bar was spacious and noisy, with the lights dimmed to a minimum, creating an intimate atmosphere. Edgar greeted his friends and paid for all the drinks up front. He was in a good mood because he finally felt like he could afford this. However, inside, something was pressing on him. He couldn't forget about Melanie. His suspicions wouldn't leave him. "What's new, old man?" Mark asked, sitting down at the table and waving his hand at the waiter to bring more drinks. "Well, guys, I've got a problem here. My wife has been acting strange lately," Edgar started, taking a sip of his beer. "Is it all because of the money?" Lewis joked, immediately laughing. Edgar smiled, but didn't respond right away. He knew his friends didn't understand the full situation, so he decided to share a bit. "Listen, I don't know what to think. She's not the same as before. Melanie is always hiding something. She often goes to meetings and doesn't say with whom. I found a couple of messages from a guy who calls himself her business partner. And all of this looks, well, kind of suspicious. But I don't have any proof," Edgar shrugged, but his voice was serious. "Are you serious?" John was surprised. "You're not stalking her, right? It could just be a coincidence. Don't overthink it." "No, I'm not stalking her, but something's off, guys. She's not the same as before," Edgar continued, feeling his story unravel in his own thoughts. "Maybe you're thinking too much about it?" Lewis said. "Money, success. All of that can change people. They can start acting differently. Haven't you noticed that?" "Maybe, but she changed overnight. Everything was fine before, and now—" Edgar paused, staring at the bar wall, trying to gather his thoughts. "I don't know why, but I feel like something's going on." His friends, smiling and laughing, didn't seem too concerned about his problems. They thought it was just a midlife crisis, or that he was overreacting to small things. "All right, let's drink to that," Mark shouted, raising his glass. Everyone joined in, and the atmosphere lightened again. But Edgar still couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. While he drank, his mind couldn't stop thinking about Melanie. She was distancing herself more and more, spending more time with friends, working on projects she never mentioned before. She even started changing her style, buying new clothes, and was noticeably more confident. "All right, I think I just need to relax," he told himself. "Let things be as they are. I'll do everything I can, but maybe I'm overthinking it." At that moment, the bar became even more lively. He sat and talked with his friends, but thoughts of Melanie still wouldn't leave him. He still felt like something needed to be done, but couldn't figure out what. The next day, Melanie came home looking tired, as always after her meetings. She didn't even ask where he had gone, although it used to bother her before. "Where have you been?" she asked, taking off her coat and leaving it on the chair. "You didn't tell me you were going anywhere." "I was meeting with friends," he replied, not hiding anything. "They congratulated me on some good news regarding my investments." Melanie nodded slightly, but her gaze was distant again. She became absorbed in her phone, leaving him to himself, but Edgar already had the certainty that it was no longer just business. "Is everything okay?" he asked, approaching her. "Yeah," she replied, looking up, but there was no warmth in her eyes like there used to be. That evening, he didn't press her, but decided to leave the question unanswered. They didn't talk about it. He just sat in his thoughts, respecting the silence. Edgar felt that something had changed. Melanie looked better than ever. Her style had become more refined, and she began paying more attention to her appearance. She frequently bought new dresses, expensive accessories, and her look became flawless. Every time he looked at her, she looked like a superstar. She started taking much more care of herself than before, and this could not help but catch his attention. With each passing day, Melanie became more independent. She began asking for money more often for personal expenses, such as cosmetics, new clothes, and travel. At first, Edgar didn't pay much attention to it, since financially everything seemed fine. But the more she spent, the more uncomfortable he felt. One day, Melanie confessed that she had joined a business circle and invited him to join her at one of the meetings. She said she wanted him to see who she was working with, as well as the people and partners of her blog. "This is an important step for us. I want you to become a part of this world too," she said, almost convincing herself. The next day, Edgar put on an expensive suit, selected an elegant watch, and they both went to the event. Melanie was stunning. Dress, makeup, hairstyle, everything flawless. She looked like a real businesswoman, and Edgar couldn't help but notice how much she had changed. He couldn't stop thinking that this new lifestyle of hers might be hiding more than just professional growth. When they arrived at the venue, they entered a large hall where dozens of people were already gathered. Many new faces, elegantly dressed men and women. Melanie immediately began talking to a few men, her partners, with whom she worked on her blog. She looked confident and open, her voice soft and pleasant, and she joked with them without hesitation. While she was socializing, Edgar decided not to stay on the sidelines. He had his own plans, to reinvest some of his money into an interesting business venture. So he went to another room where there were also businessmen and began meeting people. His attention was drawn to one of the guests, Mr. Jingles, a fairly well-known figure in investment circles. "Hi, my name is Edgar," he began, extending his hand to Mr. Jingles. "I'm looking for interesting investment opportunities. Are you involved in anything exciting?" he continued, trying to establish a connection. Mr. Jingles responded with great interest, and soon they found themselves engaged in a serious conversation about investment opportunities in tech startups. Edgar felt confident, surrounded by a good atmosphere, discussing various ideas. Just as he was absorbed in the conversation, a noise from another part of the room caught his attention. He turned around and saw Melanie standing in the center of the room. She was laughing and talking with one of the men, who appeared much older than her. He was tall, with dark hair and an elegant posture. Melanie was standing too close to him, her eyes sparkling. She was smiling, and he had his arm around her, holding her by the shoulders. At first, Edgar didn't understand whether it was just a greeting or if they were really close. Melanie was very sociable, and he knew her work involved interacting with different people. Still, his heart began to race a little. He couldn't ignore it, so he continued watching. Suddenly, Melanie and the man stepped away and moved toward the dance floor. Edgar, initially not believing his eyes, began to feel his heart tighten. He didn't approach them but stood aside, just watching. They danced together. The dance wasn't just friendly, but there was some ease and natural chemistry between them. The man had his arm around Melanie's waist, and her head was resting on his shoulder. They looked like a couple. Edgar felt his breathing becoming heavier. His hand, somehow, reached for the glass, and he drank it in one go. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't approach them. He couldn't tell Melanie he was jealous. He just stayed there, watching them, feeling the tension building in his chest. From across the room, Mr. Jingles approached him. "Everything okay, Edgar?" he asked, noticing his serious face. "You look a bit surprised." Edgar didn't answer right away. He just nodded and looked back at the dance. He couldn't explain what he was feeling. He couldn't understand what exactly had happened. "It might just be a casual dance," he finally said. "I don't want to get worked up." Edgar kept trying to calm himself down. It was just his thoughts. But he liked the event, and he decided he would go with Melanie to more business meetings like this one. At the next event, Edgar saw the same man again. Melanie, as before, was surrounded by various people, but his gaze immediately locked onto him. The man who had danced with his wife was standing in the corner with a glass of wine, and Melanie was nearby, energetically explaining something to him. Edgar observed from the side, trying to keep all his suspicions out of the event. He tried to convince himself that they were just friends, that everything was fine, but his heart told him otherwise. He turned back to his acquaintances and tried to focus on the conversation, but his thoughts kept returning to this pair. Why was Melanie so often near him? Was it just a professional relationship, or was it something more? That evening, Edgar felt increasingly like an outsider at the event. He couldn't understand why he was so disturbed by what he had seen. Why did this man cause him such discomfort? Maybe he was just overthinking it? Maybe it was just a normal relationship between partners, one he didn't quite understand? He decided that it was all just his imagination. However, just as he began to calm himself, Melanie approached him. She looked stunning, her dress glowing in the light, but Edgar noticed a hint of wariness in her eyes. He couldn't quite pinpoint why, but something was off. Melanie didn't have that natural calmness that usually set her apart. "Hey, is everything okay?" she asked, approaching him. Her voice was calm, but something in her mannerisms told Edgar that she was trying to hide some tension. "Yeah, everything's fine," he replied, trying to mask his uncertainty. "You seem very busy tonight." "We're here with partners, discussing some new ideas for the blog," she said. "But I'd really like you to talk more with them. They're interesting people." Edgar nodded, but he felt that something in her words and behavior wasn't entirely truthful. He sensed that her words had become less convincing, and the events he had witnessed only added to his doubts. They spoke for a few more minutes, but in the end, Melanie returned to her circle of acquaintances. Edgar decided not to give in to his thoughts and leave things as they were. He went back to the conversation with other people, trying to relax. However, his eyes again searched for Melanie in the room. He saw her when she left with the same man. This time, they weren't just standing next to each other. Their interaction seemed more romantic. The man noticed that Melanie was smiling, her head slightly tilted as they talked. She glanced at him more than once, and that gaze seemed more than friendly. Edgar turned decisively and walked to the bar, trying to escape the sight. He felt like he had fallen into a trap of his own thoughts. He could no longer ignore what was happening before his eyes. And even though he didn't know exactly what was going on between them, he felt that something was wrong. And so, as the evening was nearing its end, Edgar saw Melanie and the man leave the event together. He noticed they went to the elevator together. And then his heart stopped. This was no longer just a suspicion. He was almost certain something was happening. But for now, he couldn't be fully sure of what had transpired. The next day, he couldn't calm his thoughts. Melanie, as always, was incredibly charming, but he could see that she had started to behave even more distantly. Her gaze was cold as she discussed her affairs with friends or partners. And when he asked her why she so often didn't come home from work, she replied briefly, "I have a lot to do right now." Edgar couldn't help but notice how her world had started to drift away from him, how all their shared moments gradually disappeared. Those little things he once loved about their relationship now seemed insignificant to Melanie. She had become less available, and he felt more and more that her heart was no longer with him. This made Edgar start searching for evidence, even though he knew it could lead to great pain. He began checking her phone, her social media, everything that could be checked, trying to find even a single thread of truth. One day, while sitting at home, he saw a message Melanie received during her lunch with friends. She often replied to this man's messages. He couldn't resist and opened it. "I miss you so much, Melanie. You know I'll always be on your side. I can't wait for the next time we'll see each other." These words were the last straw for him. He knew she was hiding something from him. The next morning, after the evening meeting when Melanie had left Edgar alone, he sat at the table, swallowing his morning coffee, trying to remember every detail of that night. Melanie had been distancing herself more and more, and her mysterious behavior only added doubts. His mind couldn't find a clear explanation, but he felt that the situation was beginning to worry him. Edgar sat in the silence of his home, watching Melanie seemingly disappear from his life. Her withdrawal was becoming more and more obvious. She no longer spent evenings with him, her attention was increasingly diverted to other matters, and he was left alone. Every movement and every word now seemed insincere. He didn't know exactly why this was happening, but he felt that something had changed between them. Those small moments when they spent time together were gone. No more shared walks, dinners where they just talked about everything in the world. Instead, Melanie started spending more time with other people, friends, work partners, strangers he didn't know. And all of this made him anxious. Something was wrong, and he could feel it. One time, after she came home late in the evening, he decided to speak up. "Melanie, you've changed so much lately. I can't understand what's happening. What happened to us?" She, without lifting her gaze, replied, "Edgar, it's just, I'm working a lot. I need some time for myself. Everything's fine." These words didn't convince him. She was distant again, speaking words that made no sense. That's when he decided to act. One evening, when Melanie went to another meeting with her friends, he stayed home alone. The feeling that something was stopping her kept him restless. Edgar decided to go to the place where she spent more time, her favorite cafe. He didn't plan on looking for anything, but this place had become her regular hideout. In the cafe, he sat at a corner table where he could observe the visitors without drawing attention. This was her favorite spot, and he knew she might show up there. A few minutes later, the barista approached him and greeted him. "You're here again, Edgar? You always sit in the same spot." "Yes, just looking for someone," he replied, trying to hide his nervousness. The barista smiled and walked away. Edgar began observing the people around him. He wasn't expecting to see anything specific, but simply wanted to be where she might be. Soon, his attention was drawn to a conversation at the neighboring table. It was a group of people, and among them, he noticed a man he had heard about from Melanie before. The man was laughing and talking with the others, and Edgar wondered why she had never mentioned him in their conversations. He noticed the man seemed familiar with her friends, and when Melanie entered, her gaze immediately met his, and she smiled. Edgar felt more and more that something wasn't right. Melanie quickly approached the table, joined the group, and started chatting. But the more he watched, the faster his heart began to race. She was acting strangely, laughing too loudly, her gaze seemed insincere, and, most striking of all, she began touching the shoulder of that same man he had heard about. He couldn't watch any longer. He realized that this was no longer just friendship or collaboration. His intuition told him that there was more to it than he could imagine. But he didn't intervene. He quietly got up and left the cafe, his heart overflowing with suspicion. A few days later, he decided to ask Melanie directly. They were sitting at the table in their apartment, and he decided not to delay the conversation. "Melanie, I'm asking you directly. Who is this man? You're constantly in touch with him. What's going on between you two?" She looked surprised, but her gaze was slightly distant. She remained silent for a few seconds, then, with a smile, replied, "He's just a business partner. Nothing special. You know, I'm working on my business, and this is just part of my job." But Edgar felt that this wasn't the whole truth. His suspicions grew even stronger. He continued to observe, and his heart wasn't deceiving him. He understood that the real truth might be completely different. Melanie didn't know for a long time that Edgar was already on his way to uncover all of her secrets. He couldn't explain why his intuition wasn't deceiving him, but he knew the time was coming when he would have to learn the whole truth. After that conversation in the cafe, Edgar realized that maybe he was wrong, but from the very next morning, he apologized to his wife, Melanie. She seemed angry and said, "You act like a smart man, but you're behaving like a teenager. Stop being so jealous. Even if I were cheating on you, I'd do it in a way that you'd never suspect." These words seemed to shake Edgar. He started to wonder why she was saying that. That day, Melanie mentioned that she was going to stay at a friend's place for the night. Edgar realized he needed to act carefully, and he wanted to find out who this friend was. Melanie told him where she was going and even left the address. That evening, Edgar cautiously drove to the address, but he didn't see Melanie's car. He knocked on the door. Edgar stood in front of Melanie's friend's house, breathing heavily. He tried to calm his emotions, but the realization that Melanie might have been deceiving him kept him uneasy. He didn't know why, but he instinctively felt something was off. Every look she gave him, every word she said, seemed to raise more questions and fewer answers. Melanie's friend, Lisa, was as attractive as his wife. She welcomed him into her luxurious home, invited him to sit at the dining table, but he still remained on edge. "What's going on, Edgar?" Lisa smiled, but the smile seemed a bit forced. "Didn't Melanie tell you she was going? She's always in touch with you. I just don't understand why she said she was coming to you, then left so quickly. You saw how she acted? She didn't say anything about her plans." Lisa nervously fiddled with her coffee cup. It seemed like she didn't know how to react to such a question. "I can't say anything bad about Melanie. She's just been really busy lately. Maybe she went off to take care of something. She's always like that, really active. To take care of something at night? That doesn't sound believable," Edgar replied, growing more skeptical. Maybe she's hiding something from me. Lisa fell silent, her eyes darting around as if she were trying to recall something important. But instead of saying anything, she just shrugged. I don't know. She didn't say anything to me about it. Really? Edgar felt even more confused. Suspicion started swirling in his head again, a feeling that had been troubling him for a long time. Lisa, don't you have any idea why she's acting this way? He asked suddenly. She hasn't been like this distant. I feel like something's changed, and I can't just ignore it. Lisa seemed thoughtful, but after a pause, she replied. Maybe she's just changed. People change, and we don't always understand why. I don't know. Edgar couldn't believe what he was hearing. All of Lisa's uncertain words only deepened his suspicions. Melanie was probably not just distant, but maybe she had started cheating on him. But why was she hiding it so persistently? He needed to find at least one piece of evidence, some thread of truth. As he was leaving Lisa's house, he heard her phone ring. Lisa looked at him in surprise, but quickly pressed a button to stop the call. Something stirred in his heart. Is that not her phone? He asked with curiosity, trying to remain calm. No, it's mine. Just a mistake. Lisa quickly responded, nervously trying to hide her uncomfortable expression. Sorry, don't pay attention. Edgar felt that something wasn't right, but he didn't say anything more. He left the house and drove home, trying to process everything that had happened. At home, he felt trapped. All these inconsistencies, the lines of lies that started throwing him off balance, filled every corner of his house. Melanie seemed to be there, but at the same time, she was distancing herself, as if an invisible wall had formed between them. The next day, he felt that it was time to take the final step. He knew that uncovering the truth might cause him pain, but he had no other choice. He had to find the answers. When Melanie returned home, she looked like nothing had happened. As always, her smile was carefree, but Edgar could no longer ignore everything he felt. He decided to ask her directly, even if it might make her feel uncomfortable. Melanie, will you tell me where you were last night? He asked, trying to sound as calm as possible. She stopped, as if surprised, but then responded. I was with a friend. You know, I sometimes go away for the night. Nothing special. Edgar still wasn't satisfied with her answer. He tried to keep his calm, but his gaze didn't leave her eyes. I heard something different. Lisa said you went to take care of something. I was at her place last night, and you weren't there, he said, trying to control his anger. Melanie fell silent. Her eyes became vacant for a second, and Edgar felt that something was wrong. But she quickly returned to her usual expression. I just didn't want to bother you, she said, but her voice was less confident than usual. Edgar didn't know exactly why he felt she was hiding something, but his intuition wasn't wrong. He felt that the moment of truth was coming, and he couldn't stand on the sidelines any longer. Melanie said that there would be a business club meeting today, and asked her husband if he was going. Edgar said no. He decided to go to the meeting, but do it a little later than Melanie, so that she wouldn't suspect he was onto something. He needed to find out more, figure out what was going on. He couldn't just sit at home waiting for her to return without answers to his questions. A few hours later, when everyone began to gather, he drove to the club. Entering through the side entrance, he saw Melanie standing with a few people. They were laughing, chatting, and he could see how happy and open she looked, as usual. But still, something made him uneasy. His gaze stopped on one man, whom he had seen several times before, the same man who was often around Melanie. Edgar decided to leave that spot and head to the hall. He couldn't watch their behavior any longer. It was hard to observe from the outside, because the more he saw, the more it seemed to him that there was something more between them than just friendship or business relations. Here's the translated text in English. So he carefully returned to the bar, where fortunately there were no acquaintances, and drank a glass of wine, trying to calm down a bit. However, after a few minutes, he saw them again. Melanie and the man he couldn't forget were standing together, and at that moment she hugged him, pressing herself against him. This gesture, simple yet intimate, made Edgar feel like something very important had just happened. He realized that he couldn't delay this moment any longer. The words he said would determine what he would understand and see for himself. Melanie and this man left the main hall and went to a small room. a place where usually no one went. Edgar didn't know exactly what was happening there, but he definitely couldn't leave it to chance. He followed them, trying to stay as unnoticed as possible. His heart was racing as he approached the door to the room. The sounds that reached him made him stop and listen. It was Melanie's voice, her laugh, her soft whisper, and then even some kind of scream. Everything sounded wrong, and his heart filled with anxiety. What was happening behind those doors? Could it still be called just business? Edgar got closer to the door. He could feel the cold metal of the door handle in his hands as he carefully began to turn it. And at that moment, unable to bear the tension any longer, he suddenly opened the door. "What's going on here?" he shouted, his voice sharp, barely restrained by anger. The room was silent, only the rustling of fabric and the surprised gazes of Melanie and the man, who instantly pulled away from each other. Melanie, seeing him, blushed and stepped back, but her face, the one he was now looking at, remained calm and carefree, as if none of this mattered. She tried to say something, but he didn't give her the chance. "Melanie, what is this?" he repeated, trying to stay calm, but his voice betrayed his inner pain and shock. The man who was sitting nearby got up and approached Edgar. It was the same man Melanie had been frequently talking to over the past few months. He was calm, but his eyes had a sinister gleam, as if this moment wasn't as shocking for him. "It's not what you think," the man said, trying to appear calm. Melanie also began to speak, but her words tangled into one unclear response. "Edgar, you don't understand. This isn't what it seems." Edgar stood there, unable to believe what he was seeing. It all felt like a bad dream from which he couldn't wake up. His heart was beating so fast that he thought it was about to explode. "Not what it seems?" He couldn't hold back his voice. "You're cheating on me. You promised to be honest with me, and now all of this? I've seen everything, Melanie. Everything." Here's the translation of the text into English. Melanie was silent, her face pale, and she turned away. The man tried to get out of the situation, but Edgar felt that now everything was clear. He couldn't stay silent anymore, couldn't pretend he hadn't noticed. "You knew I would notice, and you decided to play a game. But this is your game, not mine. And now you have to answer for your actions." Melanie, confused and scared, tried to come up with some explanation that could calm Edgar, but her words sounded hollow, like an echo in an empty room. Her hands clutched her chest, and her gaze was on the floor as she tried to find the strength to speak. "Edgar, I didn't mean to. It all happened by accident, and I couldn't control it. You know how I've been struggling with my career, and he just supported me when I was on the edge. I just couldn't refuse. It wasn't important." Edgar didn't answer, but his face was frozen in cold silence. He didn't hear her words. They didn't matter. Each of her phrases only deepened the wound she had caused. Without a word, he grabbed her by the arm, squeezing his fingers, and led her out of the room. He couldn't stay where those deceitful, meaningless excuses still lingered. He took her to the car, ignoring her frightened look. Melanie said nothing as they got in the car. She felt like the whole world had suddenly collapsed on her, and she didn't know how to react to it. After driving home, Edgar parked the car, not stopping to say a word. Melanie sat beside him, her lips pressed tight, clearly trying to gather herself to say something, but the words wouldn't come. They got out of the car, and when they reached their house, Edgar turned to her, his voice low and cold. "How could you do this to me?" he said, his eyes sparking with disappointment. "How could you betray me when I gave you everything you ever dreamed of? Everything. Money, stability, everything for your comfort. What did you lack? Money?" Melanie had to lower her head. Her face changed, and she felt like she had been dragged into something dark and unbearably heavy. She remained silent, but she felt her words no longer mattered. Somewhere deep inside her, echoes of past moments when she had been in the arms of that man still resonated. She couldn't deny what had happened, but what Edgar said truly struck her. "Look at this," he said, pulling his phone out of his pocket. He pressed a few buttons, and a screen appeared with his investments and stocks. Melanie watched as the number on the screen grew, impressing her. "This is your chance," Edgar said. "I have over $10 million in stocks and investments. This is what you wanted. Everything you dreamed of. I gave you everything, but it wasn't enough. Melanie stood silently, her gaze clouded. She tried to say something, but her voice seemed empty because even she couldn't believe what was happening. She looked at the numbers, and her eyes grew wide in shock. She couldn't believe he had so much money and that he had kept it from her. But she couldn't deny that her actions were part of this failure. "Forgive me," Melanie said brokenly, approaching him. "I didn't mean to. It happened by accident. I was weak. I didn't know how to stop. I want to make things right." Edgar stood silently, looking at her. His heart was no longer the same as before. Now, all he felt was anger. Only betrayal, deep enough to wound. But deep down, he understood that she couldn't fix anything anymore. "Do you want me to forgive you?" His voice was warm, but it carried a rage. "You can't even tell the truth, Melanie. You betrayed me, and you can't just undo it. You can't just say, 'I'm sorry.'" And then he did something she hadn't expected. There was something in his eyes that made her freeze. She felt as if an even heavier burden had fallen on her heart. She realized that this moment would change everything. "I won't forgive you, Melanie," he said, his words soft, but they felt like a knife through her heart. "But I will give you a chance for revenge." She couldn't believe her ears. He looked at her with a cold gaze, and she felt as if her whole world had collapsed. "You don't understand," he said slowly, "but I'm not holding on to you anymore. You want me to forgive you? No, I won't let you escape responsibility for what you've done." He paused and looked at her, then added, "Now you'll feel what real betrayal is. Now you'll learn what real pain is." Melanie stood frozen. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't say anything. It was all over. She couldn't change what she had done anymore. Edgar took back the money he had given her, took all the gifts, everything she had. He had a marriage contract that he had forged to suit himself. And now, he had done everything to leave his wife Melanie speechless. Why do money and wealth change people so much? Share your thoughts in the comments.